Welcome back to the Intuition Incubator. Today I have with me Dr. Hemal Patel, who is a tenured professor and vice chair for research in the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of California, San Diego, and has a dual appointment as a Veterans Administration research career scientist and VA research pharmacologist at the VA San Diego healthcare system. He's also the chief advisor for Versailles Discovery. He obtained his PhD in pharmacology and toxicology from the Medical College of Wisconsin and did postdoctoral work at UCSD in the Department of Pharmacology. He's made seminal contributions in shaping new investigation areas on defining the impact of membrane structure on cell, organ, and organismal physiology and metabolism, with implications for cardiac, ischemia, reperfusion injury, heart failure, diabetic cardiomyopathy, aging, pulmonary hypertension, cancer, and neurodegeneration. His focus on energetics in cell biology touches upon all these and is a control point for managing and empowering human health resilience. Welcome, Dr. Patel.
See you.
So listen, the reason that I reached out to have you on the show and the way that I know you is because you are in charge of all the research for Dr. Joe Dispenza events, right?
Yep.
So, however many years ago that was now, that the decision was made to start researching at these events and researching what exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I was just on a call with Joe and we were reminiscing, right? So he's been doing research for a long time before we got involved, but it's our 5-year anniversary with Joe this coming February of 2025. So it's been a 5-year journey. And 3 of those years were pandemic years where we were dealing with stuff going on with the whole world. And 2 of them have been sort of clean years where we can literally do high-end research at a very high level with the number of subjects and things we look at. So it's been a journey, but we've discovered a lot of things and some really cool things that we're cooking up as well.
I can't believe it's been 5 years. Like I
I know.
remember your very
Yeah.
first event.
Seems like 25 years, but it's only been 5 years. Right?
Yeah, you've lived a lot through that. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, because I do remember when you first, I think I was working the event that you, volunteering at the event that you very first came to, and some of the, early ones at least.
Yeah.
And I remember one time, which I'm sure you don't remember because there's so many people and whatnot, but I think we were having lunch or something. I was asking you about, hey, what's it like or whatever. And you were saying your wife, she thinks you're crazy, like
Yeah.
you meditated, you had this most amazing meditation. You come from an extremely scientific background, obviously, like this is science.
Yeah.
I'd love
Um,
for you to share your journey.
Yeah, so it's I mean I come from an extremely spiritual religious background that has a lot of science in it, and this is one of the things that you think about is why does someone who have a belief structure end up in science? And this is something that I've constantly had to navigate throughout my life. I was raised as a Hindu, never really practiced, did the things where you light a candle when your mom tells you have to do it because you're waiting for a big test score or something like that, the superstitious aspect. But there are strong elements in Hinduism that were part of our living structure growing up. I never really explored my Indianness and Hindu aspect until I went to college, which is when I started taking philosophy religion classes, and I actually double declared a major. So I was biology because that was the thing to do. And then I ended up at a liberal arts school where you had to take classes outside of your main interest. And one of the first things I took was an intro to philosophy class, and I loved it. And so then I started doing more of these classes and double majored. And so most of my philosophy of religion was very religion focused. My wife, who I met in high school, we've known each other forever. She grew up Catholic, and I knew nothing about Western theology. And so this was my time to explore that. And so I got to do a deep dive into Western theology and then really learn where my roots were from Eastern theology and was able to integrate those aspects and think about sort of the commonalities and differences in religions and other structures that people come up with the caveat that my science was sort of the grounding aspect, this idea of reason and faith and all these things. Um, I chose a path where instead of going to med school, which is what most kids do with a biology degree, or going to law school with a philosophy of religion degree. I ended up as a PhD. I really found a niche and an interest where I wanted to look at a problem and be able to design experiments to solve that problem. And this is what I think scientists that are at the forefront are doing, is they see something that is a curiosity and it nags them so much that they want to figure it out, right? And so this is something that's been a running theme in my life, is I'll find a problem that just won't leave me, and I'll come up with ways to test it and solve it and think about it in unique kinds of ways. I did my PhD in pharmacology, which is a very broad discipline. You can literally apply that knowledge to any organ system you want, any kind of biology. And we were looking at sort of core things in my thesis on cardiovascular health, right? How do you protect the heart from a stress event? And looking back now, 20, 25 years from when this happened, it's interesting that the phenomena that I was trying to discover a drug for, the body naturally creates. And now I'm in a space where the phenomena that Joe creates, this aspect of mind body health, is an internal thing that fixes things. And we're trying to solve the same problem. We're trying to come up with figuring out how things work. So my thesis was around this idea of protecting the heart from an ischemic injury. And so it turns out that if you actually create a small injury in the heart, where you physically create a heart attack, but let that heart recover, it creates this endogenous preconditioning modality where now if you come back and give it a major heart attack, it's completely adapted from that stress, right? And so the body has these natural things that it can elevate, signaling proteins, endogenous chemicals that create this resiliency. And what we as humans do is we try to exploit this in unique ways where we then come up with drugs that do this without having to do that manipulation, right? And so I did that, and we had some amazing discoveries that we made. And then we moved to San Diego, which is where I did my postdoc. And I continued down this path of what a traditional scientist would focus on. You find a protein, you beat to death this protein and everything you could imagine. And we found an amazing protein that does some really cool stuff. We're able to show its involvement in the heart and the brain and the liver and the kidney and aging. I mean, you name it, this protein's involved in. To the point where we're at a place where one of our patents was licensed with a lot of collaborators we work with. And then this is going to be a product that's moving forward for a cure for ALS, hopefully in the next
Wow.
year or so. So there's a path that sort of occurred. 5 years ago, we got introduced to Joe, and we've essentially gone down this similar ideas. How do you take 20 years of my sort of brain coming up with ideas of looking at problems, and how do we now apply that technology, those ideas, that creativity to this problem of mind body, right? People know that the mind fixes things, and they've only looked in a rudimentary sense of what happens to the body. What we want to uncover is what's the whole picture, right? How does the mind actually change the body? And can we look in a very precise way at how it's doing this to then really come up with a way of making meditation and mind body approaches mainstream? Right now, they're seen as this alternative peripheral end. And could we really bring them to the forefront as something that should be used in every modality kind of thing? Right. So that's where we're headed.
So when you go to the doctor, instead of, being automatically prescribed a pill, you're introduced to, hey,
Yeah.
your
I
body
mean,
can heal itself, and
right.
here's that's something to try and to work with, and
Yeah.
you
Yeah. That here's a prescription for a mind body approach, and here's a pill as well, right? Use them in combination and make everything way better than it can be.
So what was your experience when you first went to an event and started meditating? Was meditating part of your spiritual upbringing, or was this like you'd been in science so long that it was like a whole nother world?
So I had a guru in college, right? My Hinduism professor who did all the Eastern theology things that I learned. Um, Taught me how to breathe, right? I mean, this is one of the first things that we as humans, I mean, breathing is so important to our survival, yet we don't do it correctly. We just breathe to take in and survive and go to the next step. But there's ways to manipulate your breath that really change the resiliency of the body. And so I learned a lot of these breathing techniques and went through the meditative process and learned how to do that. the selfish aspect was I wasn't getting much sleep. And so how could I function with even less sleep? And meditation was the answer at that time, right? I would do 2 rounds of meditation a day, and I could literally get by on 3 hours of sleep, which is not a good thing to progressively do. But there is this restorative capacity that meditation has at a deep level, right? You feel way more rested with way little time than you typically would sleep and sort of do this, because your mind is focused and fixated on this contemplative aspect. I swear during that time when I was doing this meditation for a couple years in college that I floated off the ground and could, but anyway, that's my
You
own
had that
projection of that.
experience even prior
It
to.
felt that, right? And
Yeah.
then life happens, and then I hadn't really explored it. I mean, other than praying and other things that we did, nothing really came close to that experience. I went through a conversion in my life as well. So my mom died yeah, about 10 years ago. And when she was sort of the spiritual center in my life, and when that's gone, you start to question a lot about who and what you are. And at that time, I had a series of dreams that led me down this path to converting to becoming Catholic. And so, I could then be whole with the family in the sense that our kids grew up in the Catholic faith. My wife is a Catholic. And it's been this sort of interesting turn in my life where you have something else to sort of fixate and focus on. And it's really been a journey, right?
Yeah.
And I never do anything halfway. So I've poured myself into that. And there's something about a belief structure, a faith, of praying and connecting and doing these things that takes your mind to a different place. And then I started doing the work with Joe, and that takes it to another place. And there's lots of commonalities and elements to this. And so it's been a great journey. Um, my first event was Orlando in 2021. And it was probably a first time in a long time where I checked out of my life. This is where I think a lot of people struggle. They come to these events and they're still tied and tethered by their phone and their computers to the work element. And it's hard to do both. And so I'd made the conscious decision that I didn't want to deal with the work, that I'd escape for a week and really pour myself in. It was transformative, right? As most people describe that go all into these experiences, is it makes you go to a place in your mind that you've never gone to, and it teaches you how to do this at a very high level. And when you do this, things happen in your body, and they happen in profound kinds of ways. I experienced this. I think I cried a lot that week, and it was very cathartic for me because you're just releasing a lot of the things. And I think one of the things that I held on to a lot is my mom's passing, and I think that was something that I worked through during that week, and it was a massive discharge of information and other things that happened, right? And so I think this is where your body then tends to heal. And we're looking at this process of what happens when someone goes through this immersive change. What is their body doing in response to this? And the way we do this is we want to capture everything and anything we can get, right? And so the human has lots of things that they secrete, um, leave their body, retain in their body. And we're looking at all of those elements to get a sense of who that person is before the event, after the event, and as they're evolving into a new person. And we think that that's sort of the information we'll need to figure out how this is actually working.
And one of the reasons I know that this is such a beautiful opportunity to research meditation and its effects on health is because at these events, people are captive. Everybody's sleeping in the same place. Everybody's eating the same
Yeah.
food. Everybody's doing the same meditations. They have the same schedule.
Yeah.
And so that's how one of the other scientists, I think, that worked with Joe said, hey, this is the opportunity to really do some deep research in this
Yeah.
area.
Yeah.
And so what are you, I remember during the times of COVID, let's start there. What did you find? What did you learn from studying these people? And what did you study? What did you do exactly? You took blood, you put brain scans on. What
Yeah,
happened?
so if you can imagine, I call it the human collectome. There's so many things you can collect from a human, right? You can collect their blood, you can collect their saliva, you can collect their biometric data through wearable devices, you can collect their poop, You can collect their urine. There's things that I've thought of that I've gone and we haven't done yet, but you can collect a lot of other things, right? And then you can collect other things that we're thinking of way outside the box. And one of the elements is we can collect their face, their voice, their words, and those sorts of things as well. Things that you wouldn't normally connect to biological data. We're starting to connect to biological data as a way of looking at how the person is evolving. And so we really want to see how from day 0, when they haven't experienced anything, to day 7, at the end of that retreat, that person changes biologically and biochemically and molecularly and other things as well. And so we've uncovered a lot of things. I think the data that's out there right now that we can talk about is the published stuff with the first paper we had. This was during the COVID pandemic. And it was sort of a necessity experiment that was done, right? If you could come back to the university and work on projects that were related to COVID, you were able to come back and unlock your labs and do stuff. And so we had all these initial meditation samples from the Indian Wells event, which was the first event where we actually did some studies, which was February of 2020. And then everyone knows what happened in March of 2020. The world essentially shut down. And so when we came back, we started using these samples on a variety of cells, and we were looking to see if it changed the behavior of the cells in a resiliency capacity. And so we wanted to study COVID in this process. And to study the live virus, we'd have to work in a BSL-3 facility, which had a long line out the door to work in. So we became a little creative, and we actually created a fake virus. And so it looks like SARS-CoV-2 on the cell surface. So this is called a pseudovirus. So it looks like the spike proteins and all of the things look the same. The internal guts we removed and we replaced with a reporter protein called a red fluorescent protein. And so now what we could see in my lab, which is a BSL-2 facility, is you could add this pseudovirus to your dish and you can look at infection by just seeing if the cells turn red, right? So we had a very quick readout of whether the cells turn red or don't turn red. So as you would expect, this pseudovirus, just like SARS-CoV-2, is very good at infecting cells. So if you take a cell that's just sitting there, a lung cell, and you expose the pseudovirus on there, all of them become red in 24 hours. The entire plate is red because it's starting to express that protein. Interestingly, if you take plasma from a meditator before the week-long event starts, so this is in their dysfunctional state where they still have got their disease, their stress, their anxiety, their sort of dysfunctional behavior, the same thing happens. The cells all turn red. But then if you take those same individuals and make them go through that 7-day event where they're crying, where they're, excreting, where they're thinking, where they're screaming, where they're going through all of these things where they create this mega change in who and what they are. And we capture that mega change with their blood, right? So we have their blood before and after. Now, if we take that blood at the end of that week and we put it on those cells, the red disappears. We don't get red inside those cells anymore. So there's something that these individuals are expressing in that 7 days in a concerted kind of way. We're not just doing this in one individual, right? There's 30, 40 individuals that we're looking at that have done this. There's something that they express as a group that's preventing this virus from doing what it should do, infect the cell and put that red protein in and represent what SARS-CoV-2 would do in a human body. So then, like any curious scientist, we have to break things to figure out what's in them, and the curiosity just continues. And so there's lots of esoteric techniques that you can apply to figure out what the factors are that create this phenomenon that we're seeing. So we were able to do a series of biochemical experiments to then identify unique features within this plasma of a meditator at the end of that 7 days that could possibly create this diminishing of COVID infectivity in a dish, right? And so this paper was published in Brain Behavior Immunity Health, where we identified a unique factor called SERPINA5 that meditators outlandishly increase relative to non-meditators. And this heightened protein expression kept the virus from going in. We could show that there is a biological effect of this. So this SERPINA5 is a protease inhibitor. And one of the ways that SARS-CoV-2 gets into the cell and into the body is that it attaches to these receptors, and there's a protease that comes in and acts like scissors to cut this interaction allowing the virus to go in. So the thing that the meditators increase is a protein that inhibits the scissors from working. And so now the virus sits on the cell surface and it can't get in to do what it needs to do to infect the cell, create disease in the body, and all of these things, right? And so this is a profound thought that a meditator, without taking a drug, and most of these individuals were not vaccinated because this was pre-vaccine and all of these things that came out. I think in the study there had been one person that may have had one of the vaccines, as reported in the paper. But they're naturally creating a molecule that has responded to the environment that's around them that prevents infectivity, right? So by meditating, they create this product in their body endogenously that prevents the virus from going in. So we did a survey across the globe, and we asked people about their meditative experiences and then their experience with COVID and infectivity and disease and progression and those sorts of things. And this large survey that was done, where I think we had almost 3,000 people respond, we saw a similar reporting that individuals that meditated had less infectivity, and then individuals that meditated that ultimately got a COVID positive diagnosis had a decrease in the symptomology. So they had less loss of smell, they had a faster recovery, and all of these things. So it's amazing to see that at the population level, there's a benefit of meditation. And then we're able to show this from an event that Joe runs on a dish, right? We could take
Right.
everything out of the larger system and put the smallest unit of this, which is factors in a blood, on a dish and show the exact same effect. I mean, it's a really cool story.
Yeah, and it's not like you have to go to an event to do this.
Right. Yeah. It
It's
helps. I think the events give you some guidance in how to create this in your life. And then it's practice. The more and more you do it, the better and better you get at it.
And this was happening, of course, during a time when the world was locking down. Everybody was going inside and they were saying, hey, you have to take this vaccine, you have to take this, you have to take this.
Yeah.
And here's, a couple thousand people who are meditating, and you have a control group, you've got a group of people you're studying, and statistically people are meditating and developing something that keeps the virus at bay, keeps
Yeah.
it on the outside of the cell from infection.
Yeah.
So
And we're
that must have
starting
been
to, I
pretty
mean, we're,
stunning for you.
yeah, right. And we're learning from that model, right? So then the question becomes, well, if the body can create information that prevents this virus, can the body create information that prevents cancer, Alzheimer's, aging? I mean, you name it, we can look at it, right? And so this is where the world now explodes, and the science mind gets so curious at this, is what is the meditator creating? And can we learn more and more information about what that creation is ultimately?
But does the science mind get so interested? Your science mind does.
I would
But
hope so, right? I mean, and I think this is where I have a very open mind, right? And I think as a scientist, I just can't understand people that have a fixated mindset, right? How are you a scientist then, right? Scientists should have this natural curiosity about everything that they encounter and see. That's one of the problems I have, is I can't shut my brain off. So anytime I'm driving or walking or thinking, I'm constantly focused on experiments and ideas and things that I can think about, right? Um, but there are scientists that have a very biased way of what they're looking at and what they want to see. And I think these are the ones that are the hard ones to convince and go beyond. And so this is why we're hoping that our large data sets that look at all of this biology and molecular biology and unique assays where you eliminate a lot of those variables and we can continue to show those effects will hopefully convince these individuals that there is a change that the human body can make, right? And that we can capture this and get a sense of what that change ultimately is.
and you mentioned that there's other ways you can actually are discovering where you can do it by voice and all that kind of thing. And I know that you were part of the research for what's it called? Life Energy, a new the infoceutical waters.
Yeah, Harry Massey's company, Ness Health, Energy for
Yeah.
Life. Yeah,
Yeah, I've been experimenting with those and it's fascinating. It's like a 10-second voice thing.
yeah,
And I got a whole bunch of like, hey, this is where your body is not doing the right things. got some structured water, took that, and then took another voice thing. And lo and behold, there was, a whole other set because those first things had been taken care of. And that
Yeah.
second set I knew was real because I know that like I have a issue with my skin,
Yeah.
and then the second set was all about skin. And just from a 10-second voice
Yeah. It's
clip.
it's amazing what our thoughts, our vocal patterns, our face tell us about who and what we are, right? And that's an interesting area, right? And if you think about the Joe experiment in this as well, is we're a bag of water. And so by going through this native experience that you do yourself, you can change that water, and you can structure yourself in a unique kind of way as well, right? And this is essentially what we're capturing in the plasma of an individual. The information that you have at the beginning of the event versus at the end of that event has dramatically changed. And it's in that water component that we're seeing a lot of these changes. The proteins, the exosomes, the metabolites, they're all shifting in an individual that goes through the 7-day event.
And how do you feel like the idea of belief works in this?
This has been a thing that's been nagging me as well, and we've been thinking about an experiment around this, and I've come up with a formula of how to do this. We just haven't had the time to put this in place. Is I think belief matters, but I think intention is more important in all of this, right? So you can be an atheist that has no belief structure in all of this, but you can intend something where you will it to happen. And I think that willing it to happen is a certain belief structure, but an atheist can still have that willing aspect, right? There's this notion that you have to be religious in some way to achieve this thing. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think it helps. I think if you have a faith and a belief structure, your mind is possibly more suggestible and more in this space where you're willing to bend a little bit, to stretch and think about what the possibilities are. I think someone who doesn't have that faith and belief structure, maybe it takes them a little more, but that intentionality becomes really important. So one of the things we've been thinking about is, um, can you just passively participate in this event and get an effect, right? So could you literally just sit there and not do any of the meditations and just be present and absorb the energy in the room and see the effect? I bet you could, right? And we've done some rudimentary pilot studies where we've seen some crazy thing happen to individuals that are sensory deprived and they go through this event. They absorb things, right? There's a lot of energy in that room, and that energy somehow transmutes into what the body's doing. But I think that there's a graded effect, right? If you then have some element of intentionality that tracks with what you're doing, so there's a purpose to what your mind is trying to create, I think you get an elevated aspect of what that change is. And so we're interested in looking at that. What are the graded effects of belief and non-belief in all of this?
Yeah, that's interesting because when I asked the question, I wasn't talking about belief in religious. And actually, I would argue that religious belief can actually go the opposite way. That because there's such rigidity in whatever the religion may be, or however orthodox you are in
Yeah,
that there's less of a belief. But what I meant was belief that this is real, belief that you have that capacity, believing that not just the guy next to you could do this, but you could
right.
do it.
Right, which is where the intentionality, I think, comes in, right? And my sense of belief is more of the religious thing, in the sense that people who have that ability to be religious, granted they may be rigid and all of these other things, they have a belief structure that leads to them to make conclusions about things they can't see or experience in a unique way, right? And this is God. Can't
Yeah.
see him, we can't touch him, we can't smell him, we can't do all of the things that our senses allow us to do, yet you believe that this person, this thing exists, right? And that's, I think, that belief aspect is, I think those individuals that can do that, their mind can go further ultimately. Not necessarily that someone who doesn't have that belief structure can't, but I think it makes it that much easier,
Yeah.
hopefully.
The thing that I think a lot about is this idea of believing with your mind versus believing with at some other deeper level.
Yeah,
So I think that from an intellectual standpoint, there's so many of us that can believe. Like, yeah, like
Yeah.
I know what you're saying. I hear what
Right.
you're saying. I've
Yeah.
seen you present this 1,000 times. I 100% believe it to be
Yeah.
true.
Right.
But when it comes to healing myself, that's a deeper belief. Like it's got to move from my mind
Right.
somewhere else in
Yeah.
me
Yeah.
that truly at a root core level beyond my subconscious believes that I am that powerful, that my body, my
Yeah.
biological structure is that powerful.
Right. Which is, I think, the tough thing for everyone, right? It's to take in information and then internalize it in a way that matters to you. And I think that's the big struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I know you're doing a lot of stuff with mitochondria.
We are, yeah. It's been something that's been, again, the nagging part of it, right? So a lot of the biology we look at comes down to energy, right? And Joe talks about energy in a very unique kind of way. We talk about energy in a very biological, unique kind of way as well. So the caveat to this in living systems is mitochondria. And so mitochondria are really, really old bacteria that got incorporated into cells probably about 1.5 billion years ago, and they created this symbiotic relationship. And so what they provided for the cell was a way to create a biochemistry where you make way more energy than the cell needs to basically function. And so now with all of this energy, you can create complexity to the design, right? You can start building unique structures. You can create unique elements. You can start putting these cells together to create more complex and targeted organisms. And for us, it creates the complexity of thought, consciousness, all of these other things. Every cell in your body has mitochondria except your red blood cells. And there's probably about 30 plus trillion mitochondria in your body. And so these really become the conduit for how we engage with the world. We're involved with Versailles, and part of Versailles is really to launch this idea of mitochondrial testing. And so we've come up with a finger stick test that allows you to basically measure your mitochondrial functionality and get really cool elements of what your mitochondria are doing. And the notion is, can we get this to be done at a consumer level with scale, right? And so, could you give people information about who and what they are at an energetic capacity level? Since they're everywhere, it determines a lot of your health status, right? How you feel is really tied to your mitochondria. One of the things that most people don't think about is, why do you die when you stop breathing, right? When you don't get oxygen in your system. The oxygen is one of the major things that mitochondria use to make that energy. And so they're the ones that are consuming that oxygen in this unique kind of way when it's delivered to all of the cells in your body, all of the organs in your body. So if you don't have oxygen, your mitochondria don't have the raw resources to do what they do. This goes back to my PhD thesis as well. The way to solve a heart attack is to figure out how to balance that energy. 30% of the heart is mitochondria. And so it's literally a bag of mitochondria that's constantly generating energy. If you think about why it has to be 30%, your heart should never stop beating. If it does, you're dead, right? And so it constantly, that energy has to consume and create this organ's functionality for the eternity of your life. If you actually look and do the math, I think there's about 2 to 4 kilograms of ATP that your heart makes in a day. Yet you don't gain 2 to 4 kilograms in a day unless you're gorging and doing other things, right? And the reason for this is, as soon as that energy is made, it's consumed, right? And so we don't have a Tesla battery in our bodies that can store that energy. And so these mitochondria are these dynamic things that got incorporated that are constantly working and functioning, and they're dynamically shifting. They're making energy, they're controlling cell control points for death and survival, and they become a major conduit for this. We're applying a lot of this work and ideas to the Joe work that we're doing as well. We see some crazy, amazing changes in mitochondrial functionality from the beginning to the end of the event. We start seeing dramatic shifts in metabolites that predict this change in energy flux. And at the biological level, this is what we're seeing as in a rejuvenation state as well. One of the ideas we have around meditation is that it makes the body go into a place where you're more resilient, right? And when you're more resilient is when you're at the younger state. And so we're starting to look at elements of that, is what's happening to the energy pathways in the body in unique kinds of ways. And there's lots of tools to study that.
You said earlier that mitochondria has to do with how you're feeling.
I mean, it's sort of your energy state, right? So if your mitochondria are not functioning well, you have less energy, you feel more tired, you have brain fog. So all of those things that we equate to not
Physically feeling.
feeling physically healthy are ultimately you could sort of degrade down to dysfunction in mitochondria.
Okay, got it, got it. So, what are your thoughts about how intuition plays into this whole physical biological phenomenon?
Um, I haven't really thought much about it, but I guess that's an interesting question, right? I think individuals have certain preconceived ideas of what they expect to see. One of the things that I've experienced at these events is when the biggest things happen is when you least expect them to happen, right? When you let go of attachments, and this is a struggle that a lot of us have, and I have as well, is we're attached to this world in crazy ways: money, family, buildings, structures, and other things. And it's that attachment that leads to all of the struggles that we have: suffering, pain, anxiety, all of these things tied to those attachments in a unique kind of way. I think what I've seen and experienced in my meditative practice, in whether it's in a religious setting where I'm praying or at a Joe event, is that when your mind wanders and goes into the space where you're in this nothing area, it's when you everything opens up to you, right? And I think it's that intuition aspect that leads to that. It's to have that insight enough that you can let go of all of the attachments that you have to get into this space where you have this potential space that isn't created yet, right? That you have access to. For me, it happens in a very fleeting way. I've imagined these things. I think are maybe 15 seconds at max that I can create this capacity of. I've never measured it. I'd love to get my brain on a cap and just see if that 15 seconds is really 15 seconds, or if I'm dreaming it up and it's more like an hour, or if it's more like 15 minutes. We just don't know, right?
Right.
And I guess that's the other end of this, is maybe you don't need it to be an hour or 15 minutes. Maybe 15 seconds is a lifetime for all of those neurons to make those connections and get that download that people are asking for. But I think intuition is a major element. But I think what gets in the way of that are all the attachments that we have in the world.
And I think what gets in the way of that is related to the attachments that I wanted to ask you about is fear.
Yeah.
How do you
Well,
how
fear, I think, is tied to those attachments.
Yeah.
The thought of losing that attachment, losing that connection, I think, is what creates a lot of fear in us, or not having those attachments, right? Not having a loving relationship, or not having that bond that you form with certain individuals creates a lot of fear in how we approach and see the world. Um, I mean, we've been thinking about emotionality and feelings and perceptions in studying this. One of the things that we're starting to progress with in the Joe research that we're doing with Dr. Joe is that we were really fixated on the individual, right? The first couple years was really, what is the individual doing and how are they creating a space that's altering and changing? Over the last year and a half, we've started to think about what happens to that individual when they leave that individuality in certain ways and become a part of a collective, right? Where they're now connected to different individuals in a unique way at the conscious and subconscious level. Are they then evolving at a much higher state and much higher sort of functionality? One of the things we see at these Joe events is people change from day 0 to day 7, and the group changes from day 0 to day 7. And there's got to be a correlation to all of that, right? And then the ways to look at this is the individual in their home, right? If someone goes through the same experience that you're going through at a week-long event in person with this crowd, are you going to evolve the same way as if you just tuned into the week long on a Zoom call and went through the experience, having being exposed to all of the crazy things around you with your house and your kids and your work and those kinds of things? We've got those studies planned to see how they come out. But I really think this idea of social connectedness is the next wave of where we're looking at. And I think this is where intuition and other things come in. is now when you have a collective working on a problem or thinking about a problem or creating an environment and a resiliency, the intuition goes to the next level, right? There's these weird serendipities that you identify, which then you start questioning how and why these things come together, right? And this leads your brain to a different state, I think, ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking, to me, this leads back to belief, right? It's this sense of oneness.
Yeah,
And when you have those experiences, whether they're at an event or they're in a meditation or in a breathwork session, where you lose those five senses, where you just, you separate from the five senses and you are so plugged in to that present moment that maybe in that moment, whether it's a mystical experience like some people have, or just run of the, I mean, it can happen without it being, right? Like,
yeah,
but that experience of like, I am not alone, that,
yeah,
that this is oneness and it goes beyond social togetherness,
yeah,
right? But I think that social togetherness does help propel that feeling and that
yeah,
belief. I'm not alone,
right,
and it's
right.
interesting to think about how that impacts the actual physiological, how much you're able to physiologically shift and change.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, true. I think the belief thing is an important aspect, right? And I think it's really hard to find someone at an event that doesn't have a belief in something, right? Otherwise, they won't be
Intellectual.
there, right?
Yes, intellectually at least.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But
And
there's so much
there are
underneath. There's so
right.
much
That
fear
but
underneath.
even the skeptic that's there, there's a curiosity that they have that I think
Yeah.
brings them. And they just need to be convinced with more data, with more experiential experiences that they go through at the event. They need to experience it for themselves and feel it and do that, right? And so, but there is something that brings them there. And I think there's that deep down under feeling or belief or something that does it.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to bring it, because there's so many people listening who don't go to events, right? But can heal
Yeah.
themselves and can need to understand this information, which is why,
Yeah.
I wanted to have you on. And also because you really live in two worlds. I mean, you're really an interesting bird. Like one part is like so intellectual, and just from hearing you talk, we can hear that, like so intellectual and data driven. And yet you're data driven about this thing that is so much bigger than
Yeah.
the intellect ultimately could really wrap its mind around.
Right. Yeah. And I think it goes back to that same stuff we were working on when I was in grad school, right? This idea that the body has this innate capacity to heal itself.
Yeah.
I've never really thought about it from that perspective until we started working with Joe. I mean, we've done these experiments and we sort of left the whole preconditioning notion behind because we were trying to find a drug that does the same thing. But the fact that every living system has this ability to adapt and naturally resolve and be resilient is an interesting concept that I just don't think we've mined to the point where we should be able to mine it, right? And I think this is what we're doing with Dr. Joe is really figuring out what the limits of the body are and how the mind brings that capacity to a different level.
Yeah. And the thing that I think is just so important to like call out is that, what you're saying is that the body has this ability to literally, it's your own, as Dr. Joe will say, it's your own pharmacology,
Yeah,
system. It has the ability to manufacture the very things that we're reaching for to
yeah,
solve the problems.
yeah.
So, I would like to ask you, what is it that you would like listeners to know? If there was one thing that you want people to know that you're passionate about, that you just feel is so important that people understand, what is that?
Um, I think it's to tap into who and what you are, right? I think one of the things that I notice and I get stuck into this idea is you get so absorbed by the things around you that you forget to really internalize and think about who and what you are. And I think it's not until you introvert and think about some of those things, and we live in a very extroverted society. We're raising three very strong introverts at home right now as well. And the world is not built for us, right? I one of the worst places for me to be is in the spotlight and in sort of an outside field. one of my most happy places is to be in my office with the door closed and just in my own brain thinking about stuff. Is for the world to find that, right? To find resiliency in your own mind, to go be able to go there and find a place that is truly transforming, healing, and changes the way we interact with the rest of the world. I think that's the future of where we need to head. A couple of the talks that I give typically at the end of a week-long event, they're titled "The Evolution of Species," and I think this is what we're after. And I really think the evolution of species has to come down to how we think and feel and how we evolve those thoughts to make that happen ultimately, right? And I think this is the gift that Joe provides at his events to individuals, is if they do it how he tells them and teaches them how to do it, they really learn to do this themselves, right? They learn to use their mind to regulate their body in this profound way that has that ability to do this. Individuals that don't go to an event, I think, can get there as well. There's lots of ways to create this end effect. He's just created a short circuit way of doing it much faster, right? And so it's to find this ability of how to do this yourself. And I think the world's going to change if everyone can do this.
Yeah, when you're talking, I think that's great, and when you're talking, I'm thinking like it's that safe haven that's like inside. And I have that experience, because the animal body will kick and scream, I don't want to meditate today. I don't want to do this. And every time I sit down, I'm like 2 seconds in, and I'm like, why am I kicking and screaming? This is the
Yeah,
greatest place ever. There's no
yeah,
fear here,
right. Yeah,
right? When you learn how to settle your brain and body down and really
yeah,
hit that spot, it's the sweetest spot there is.
yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Thank you so much for being here. We'll put your information in the show notes, and I really appreciate your time.
Perfect. No, that was great.